We are live. Hello and good evening, everybody. This is Suzanne Knabe-Nicole from Police Science Doctor. This is the very first live interview broadcast that I'm doing, and Patrick and I, we've had a bit of a déjà vu situation just here because we already started the interview for about 20 seconds before I realized we hadn't actually gone live. So I've pressed the button again. So sorry, there was a 20-second delay between the announced time, but it seems that we're live. And I hope that if you guys are watching this either live or later on, that we deliver some real value. So hopefully how this works is that you're seeing us on either Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. And hopefully you'll be able to leave some comments, make some comments. So say hi and ask questions, and maybe Patrick will be able to answer them. So for real this time in public, Patrick, who are you and why might people know you?
Hi, Susanna. Thanks very much for having me. I've been around quite a long time. I think that's probably the first thing to say. I've been working with sex offenders and in the investigation of sexual crime for over 30 years. I started, so I'm English, you can probably hear my voice. So, I started working in prisons back in the late 80s and then started working with sex offenders in treatment programs. Then when I moved across to Australia in the early 90s, they were just really beginning here to work with sex offenders. And so I started the first program for young people who sex offend in the youth justice system here. I did work for the football clubs, worked in prisons in the adult treatment centres. And then in 2007, moved across to working in policing. And since then, probably if people know me from anywhere, I've been talking about whole story on and off since we created it over 10 years ago as a new methodology. And I've done a lot of training in different places around the world, and Iceland and Norway and Vietnam, and it's extraordinary. I was thinking about it just before we came on. You'd think that all these countries would be extraordinarily different, and of course they are in lots of ways. But in terms of the way we investigate sexual crime and the problems in the law and the problems with courts and reporting and attrition and poor conviction rates, same problems all over the world.
Was there something in particular that you found the most gobsmacking or the most surprising about comparing all these different countries' procedures?
I think probably the most gobsmacking thing was my own staggering ignorance about each, the problems in countries and cultures, and assumptions I'd made about how they would think about sexual crime or attitudes. So I never failed to be surprised that the most gobsmacking thing that I wasn't surprised about is how much a lot of this is still based on myth and misconceptions about sexual crime, particularly about victim behaviours, how victim blaming a lot of cultures are, including the cultures of their police forces and courts, how hard it is to report. All those things are still staggering. And we really have not advanced anywhere near as far as we should, given the knowledge base we now have about sex offenders and sex offending, which has been studied for well over 30 years now in quite comprehensively. So the other thing I think that staggered me as a sort of side note to what you said is when I moved from working in the treatment field, and which had exploded with knowledge over the 80s and 90s in particular, when I moved into policing, it was a real shock to me how little of that knowledge had moved into the policing field or into the court area. So obviously there was a huge body of knowledge already there, but it didn't match up. So it reminded me again how often we work in different silos and we don't realize what other people don't know that we found out, and and vice versa.
So where do you think that it's almost a bit like a dam, isn't it? You've got all this information. You've got all this information, you know what could work, but then you actually go into practice and you find out people don't know about it, people are not using it. You said we have amassed all this knowledge. Where's the bottleneck? Where is it getting stuck? Why is it not getting to the people that need it? Because that's incidentally, it's a very nice segue. That's actually why I do Police Science Doctor, because we've got all the knowledge. And in my mind, not enough of that is getting to the practitioners. Nobody's telling the police officer, hey, this would really work well if you do it. So And they don't have academic journals. They don't have the access. They don't have the time. The journal articles, no offense, are written horribly. You know, they're not pleasant to read. And
no, they're not. No.
Turn them into videos when I can. But why do you think that problem is there? Why is the information there but not getting into the practical field?
Oh, crikey. We're going to spend the rest of the interview talking about that, I think, because that's a really dense, in a nutshell. No worries. Okay. Okay, well, let's take a word like experience. So experience is a hugely valued word in policing, say. I mean, it is in every profession, and I think lots and lots of organizations suffer from these issues. But since we're talking about policing and investigation, experience is valued about beyond all else in some ways. And look, we found trying to change culture and change attitudes, experience is one of the most problematic areas. Then if you link that to the way, certainly our police forces here work in Australia, that everybody is recruited to do the job of policing, and it's a job. So everybody goes through the same process, and then they go out on the van, and then they do pub fights and uniform work, and then they decide to specialize on where they go. So by the time you get them into a specialist area like sexual crime, which has a particular skill set and some qualities required, and we can talk about that later on if I'm sure we will, then for the large part, some people have already got those skills and qualities, and they've maintained them. Some have had them taken out of them by the training process. Some of them will not ever have those skills and qualities. So we're recruiting one person for a whole variety of different jobs and roles, where actually we determine there is a specialism here. And I don't think we're the only people to do that. Lots of people have, and lots of different areas of policing become specialisms. So you've got a problem recruiting one person to 50 jobs. The other thing we've got that's problematic is, do you retain people in particular roles because they're good at it and because their skills and qualities match those roles? Is that good for their mental health? I suppose is one of the important issues we need to discuss. But primarily, if you're a superintendent or an inspector, you just want to be able to move them where you want to move them. So specialisms are annoying. You want to be able to say, well, I've got a new problem in this particular crime thing. I need my detectives to do this or go and do that. Well, if you don't protect that particular area of crime, policing will move on, and it will take your people and move them somewhere else. And the other thing we need to talk about as an undercurrent to all of that is that none of this kind of investigative work was very popular for a very long time, for a number of reasons, including systemic sexism and a lack of interest in family violence issues and sexual offending, aside from a few occasionally elite squads who were looking at organised child sexual abuse or stranger rape, which, as we know in sex offending, are far and away the tip of a very big iceberg that's mostly based around relationship. So it wasn't popular. And the other thing that we found moving across to train in policing is it wasn't popular because a lot of detectives didn't know where the wins were. So they couldn't see where the evidence was. They couldn't see how, beyond basic points of proof, they were going to get a win in court. They couldn't see where a reasonable prospect of conviction was coming from. So they weren't interested. They're time-consuming, they're victim-centric, and if you're not going to get a win, then where will your motivation come from? Now we've got the answers to all of that, but I think that's in part the answer to your question, that organizations are already defensive against new information because of their own wanting to do it the way that we do it, because of their cultures, because of the attitudes that come with that. And at the time that we started at inspector role and above, there were probably only 20 women in the inspector role. And the setup, so the leadership was male. And now obviously that's not always a problem, but look at the research done into hypermasculinity and other, where it is problematic in policing, they're not likely to be good at these kinds of roles. So, and the way the setup was here is that most of the, this is back in 2007 I'm talking about here, so it's changed significantly since then, but the The problem was most of the victim statements and interviews were done by women officers who were usually uniform officers, and then the case was given to a detective who was usually a man, who might never meet the victim, the complainant, at all. So the whole setup and the structure of the way it was being investigated just wasn't effective. So big changes came about in terms of trying to shift the culture, but also making all the people working on sexual crime and now family violence here in Victoria all detectives. So all trained as detectives, and then all going into the specialism of family violence and sexual crime. So the answer to why doesn't that information come in, the only other thing that I'd add to that is police forces are notoriously introspective. And there was in the detective training school here, there used to be a sign up on the wall that just said dead people. And the joke was that the course had been designed by detectives who then went on to train the next people of detectives and the next, so that the people who'd actually designed the course were now dead. So they put that up as a way of saying, we've got to keep changing and we've got to keep adapting to the new areas of crime. But it's still very hard to do if what you're doing is replicating. So you're trained by an academy, you go out to be a detective based on that training, and then you go back into that academy to train. How inventive is your work going to be? So I think one of the big things that's changed here, as it has in a number of places all around the world, is they bring in outside knowledge. But at the time, myself and Mark Barnett, who were brought in to change the training programs here, we were the first people from outside policing who'd been brought in to train on different courses or bring new knowledge in. So the answer to the question is, you got to bring new people in. You've got to take those journal articles and put them in a form like you are, trying to make them more accessible. But you've got to stand in the training room in a way and look, like I've got a lot of colleagues in England, Becky Milne and Andy Griffiths and others who I know have done this kind of legwork. You've got to stand in the room and have the argument and shift that culture and bring people on board with new ideas. So it's very labor intensive and it's bloody hard work. Some of the discussions we had early on about false reporting, relevant evidence, the counterintuitive victim behavior, it was really hard work for the first few years. I think until we really nutted out what whole story was and how to work with it, and then that really helped us change those attitudes much, much more easily. Yeah.
And I think it's probably important to note as well that, you were talking about the whole institution, but also about individual officers, if they're having very little motivation, if they can't see an immediate win on the horizon.
Yeah.
I think if you are an individual officer and you're having pressures from your superiors to focus you're a very limited and very important resource, and you need to focus your resources, and that's actually an intelligent decision-making process where you've got the highest chance of getting a conviction.
Exactly.
But then also the police force is under pressure by the criminal justice system, because here in the UK it's the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, who will say whether a case can be taken to court or not. And so the police are under pressure. So I think you're right that the whole system needs to change. It's not just down to individual officers, but also to the wider perspective. So I think the more traction this whole thing gains, the more chance there is of making changes. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this whole story? So before we do, Suzanne, can I say I just want to say a couple more things about that. Let's talk about downstream orientation in a minute and how that decision gets made, because that's really critical. But before we do that, I just want to say the other thing that I discovered going around early on is that policing always had this knowledge about what worked. There was always somebody there. You'd go to a unit and someone would say, "Oh, sex offenders, you should talk to someone. Go and talk to Smithy. She or he is great with them." And then I'd go and talk to Smithy, and they would say, "Oh yeah, basically they were saying you've got to build rapport with people. You've got to give them a bit of," one of them said to me, "You've got to give them a bit of dignity, Pat. You've got to give them a bit of dignity." Now, that's not easy with someone who's been sexually abusing children. How do you sit opposite that person? And they also knew, don't try and win an interview. Let the process of an interview play itself out. Build rapport, communicate with someone. Show that on some level you can understand them. Even if you find what they did abhorrent, you can understand that they behaved in that way at that time. It's a very difficult skill set. It's difficult psychologically to be in this
frame. I mean, one of the things we did working in treatment, for example, is never do an interview, particularly with young people, never do an interview with that person the day you read the victim statement, because you just will not be in the right frame from what you've just read about what that person did. So you've got to train someone to be psychologically prepared. Then you've got all sorts of other things like child exploitation material. They're going to play tricks on you. They're going to push your buttons. I mean, I talk a lot in different trainings that I've done about the ways they try and get through to us and which ones I'm very well prepared and defended for, and which things they can do to me that I'd really struggle not to be wound up by that, you know. But the point I'm getting at is that the skill set was always there. There were always people there who knew how to do this well. They knew how to do interviews with suspects. They knew, for instance, the women who would take, mostly women who were taking victim statements, they had nearly always put the entirety of the relationship in that statement, but it hadn't been investigated in that way. I'll talk more about that when we come to whole story in a sec. So I think it's interesting that what we're trying to do really is not invent a whole new skill set or a whole new type of investigator. We're trying to take those investigators that were already there and make what they were doing the norm rather than the exception, which it was.
So basically,
and the other thing that,
so we need to basically clone Smithy, because Smithy is a very wise person.
Smithy knew how to do it, and Smithy knew
Agent Smith in the organization.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's good at something. I mean, like looking around, having been around, policing for quite a long time, there are all sorts of things that they do I would just be hopeless at, So you just got to find the people that are suited. And it comes back to that point we were talking about before about recruiting the right person and specialism and retaining people or looking after their mental health and all those sorts of things. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about that you mentioned before is who makes the decision, because it looks like it's the Crown Prosecution Service that makes the decision. But actually most attrition in sexual offence cases is done in policing. And so what it usually is, it's a guess about what over here are OPP, or we have police prosecutors here. So anything that's going to go to the magistrate's court can be prosecuted by a police officer. So whatever your setup is and wherever you are around the world and you're doing that it looks like the decision gets made at that prosecutorial point. But actually what the literature says, and certainly what our own experience says, is mostly police are determining what they think will or will not get through that hurdle. And so the phenomenon in the literature is called downstream orientation. And what's problematic about it is it's largely based on a lot of myths and misconceptions about sexual crime and particularly victim behavior. And if people do know me, back to your first question, we've just published the Australian Institute of Criminology Trends and Issues site. We've just published a paper on myths and misconceptions in adult sexual crime cases. And look, we can attach these if people are watching. I'm going to happily attach links to them. But the reason these are important is because the general public hold these views. Not only do the general public then become police officers and investigate these crimes, which is an important element, but at the end of the process, they're also the determinants as jurors in court. So that notion of, is there a reasonable prospect of conviction? Is this person credible? Is this information relevant? All those factors that determine whether cases get to court and whether there are convictions at the end are based on the public's knowledge about how this happened. It's based on our own beliefs and attitudes about sexual offending. Well, a lot of what we think isn't right. So that in and of itself is, I think, the biggest problem in the entirety of the system, particularly in the adversarial justice system. And so it'd be no surprise that even though reporting has increased quite significantly across the developed world, particularly young women reporting now, historical child sexual abuse cases have all, reporting rates have risen. Attrition has not moved or even got worse, and conviction rates have gone down. So there are some fundamental flaws still present in that system. And one of the things that I think we hope for here in our, we call it brief authorization. It's probably called something similar all around the world. But at that point where an investigator takes that brief to their sergeant or senior sergeant and says, I think this one's ready to go, at that point, do police think they have enough relevant evidence for a reasonable prospect of conviction? That should be an independent decision, but it isn't. It's based on what they think will happen next. Yeah.
I've got a question here. So obviously the comments are working. Jamie Christopher's watching on Facebook. He's saying, are you essentially offering evidence-based practice or policing as a methodology to deal with offences or investigation relating to the public protection arena?
Hi, Jamie. Can you read the question again?
Yeah. Are you essentially offering evidence-based policing as a methodology to deal with offences or investigation relating to the public protection arena? I guess she or he's asking is
Yes is the short answer to that. So the bit that I wanted to hear again was the public protection arena bit at the end, because I probably have more of my question mark around that particular area, because risk assessment and public protection and what happens with the information from investigations is kind of a secondary issue. The evidence-based practice here is really about the investigation. So whole story is built to help investigators understand that offending starts with offenders, that there is a methodology here, that most offending starts in relationship, is based in relationship, to show them that even though over here, and I suspect the figures are very similar all around the world, 85% of offending happens in the home of the offender, the home of the victim, or premises known to both or either party.
We're talking about sexual offending here.
Sexual offending, yeah. So by and large between people who know each other. And even of the offending that happens in public space, the majority of those people are still familiar with each other in some form or another. So if you talk about the kind of Facebook, you've got your core friend model and then the friendship group out and out, they'll be in this cluster here somewhere. So what we're trying to do is to say most of policing 10 years plus ago was based on the small minority outside of that group, stranger rapists and child sexual abuse perpetrators who were in cahoots together in some form or another. But the vast majority of sexual offending, it actually happens between people who know each other in some form or another. And so the nature of that relationship between those people, there is evidence in the entirety of that relationship. What was happening before in investigations is most of it, to put it crudely, and I get the no swearing thing, but to put it crudely, most of what investigators were looking for was what went where, how far did it go in, and those were to determine what the charge would be. And then was anybody else, do you have a witness in some form, or was it, obviously CCTV? And can you back up what you're saying? What else have you got that can back up what you're saying? And of course, on those criteria, prosecutions were very rare. I look back at stats of how many child sexual abuse cases were being prosecuted here in Victoria in the 80s and 90s, and it was in the low hundreds, whereas now there are thousands. So what was happening is they weren't seeing all the potential witnesses, all the potential evidence. They weren't seeing the grooming process as evidence in and of itself. They were trying to prove that a certain act happened at a certain time on a certain day. And look, particularization is still crucial to this, because we're still going to charge people with things, but it doesn't explain what happened. And when you come to explain to a jury, say, what took place between two people in private over a period of once or over a period of time, if all you have is an attempt to prove that act, you're going to be disappointed. If you think that forensic medicine will answer all your questions, you're going to be disappointed. If all those things that were traditional in trying to shore up people's views of what took place or change attitudes were very disappointing. So in answer to your question, Jamie, yes, the evidence says this happens between people who know each other. It happens in private where there are seldom any witnesses. Now, obviously, people film things or sometimes elements do get witnessed, but what is much, much more likely to be witnessed are the non-sexual elements of grooming. So one of the things we found when we started to talk to investigators is most of them thought grooming was the sexual element, trying to get people to do sexual things. And of course it is. But the most important element of grooming are the non-sexual elements that take place. So the power and control and authority that come at the beginning of these relationships. So whether it's a parent or a football coach or somebody met in a pub or whoever it is, there's always a period of time at the beginning of that relationship, whether it's 20 minutes or 2 years, where there is evidence of what took place in developing power and control and authority over that person to stop them. How can I put it? Well, look, there were guys in group when I was working in group back in the UK, and we were doing some work on grooming. These were men who sexually abused children, but the principles of grooming still apply. They were saying, one of them said, I want the child to think like me. And then the next guy said, I want him to be like me. And then the last guy said, I want him to do what I want him to do. I want him not to tell on me. And if possible, I want him to feel responsible. Which is quite difficult to hear when you imagine what that actually means to people's lives in practice. But essentially, that's what offenders are doing in their grooming processes. They're trying to get people to do what they want them to do, minimize the chances of getting caught, and if they can, make people feel responsible, or at least have doubt about how much they contributed to this particular offense or whatever. And so all those elements, when you come to a reasonable prospective conviction and the myths and misconceptions out there, an awful lot of them are about victim behavior. Why did she still stay with him? Why didn't she tell anyone for 2 weeks? Why doesn't she have any injuries, etc.? And there are lots, and read the article, there are lots. Why can she only remember certain bits? I mean, if you're talking about people who are trained in interviewing, we should talk about that later. You know, the memory ones have become critical. But the answers to all those questions, if people have them, are in the grooming process. And they're mostly, I mean, in a way, I've become sort of obsessed with grooming one. We call them grooming one and grooming two to help, offenders see the difference. But I've become obsessed with grooming one because of all the things that help investigators understand what took place, help them see where the relevant evidence is, but are also persuasive of fact finders later on in the process. It's the power and control and authority elements of those relationships where the evidence is utterly powerful and compelling. And it makes you then focus also, one of the things investigators have told us quite directly, it makes you then focus on the offender. So rather than saying, well, why was she out that late and why didn't she this and why didn't she that? We're going, well, how might he have got her to do that? So we'll ask investigators to think both those things, because you've got to answer those first questions, but you really need to see him first, because these are offenders who are initiating and victims who are responding. And it's a unique kind of construct of a relationship. I mean, you wouldn't tolerate anywhere else something so one-sided, so a dynamic, so one-sided like that. So in answer to your question, Jamie, yes, we're trying to take the evidence that is in the science around sexual offending and sexual offenders, and in particular grooming. I know it's a rather old-fashioned word now, but it's still a really important construct for people to understand, and to say that should be in our training around attitudes and beliefs for investigators. It should be there to help them see the evidence. It should also be there to protect them psychologically from the ravages of this work, and it should be throughout our criminal justice system. Absolutely.
So this, the way you describe that made me visualize like an iceberg sea, but that famous poster, and it's been used for many different, like motivation, behavior, and all kinds of things. But you see the tip of the iceberg, and that's maybe what we used to focus on in investigations. And I think what you're saying is that actually we need to look at all of that, because there's lots of evidence of deliberate planning and intent in there, but we don't see any of that. And even if we fly a drone over that whole iceberg area, we might see some icebergs popping out, but we might see some icebergs popping out, but many of them won't. But all the offending is still going on underneath. So tell us about this. So why did you develop Whole Story? Why do you think, we sort of know why you think it was necessary, but tell us more about the context and how it came about, and what difference it makes to investigations compared to how we usually see sexual offending in this investigation.
Yeah, okay, great. And the other thing I want to talk about afterwards to that is that what you need to go with it, because it's not an interview protocol, say, so you need a whole bunch of other things, of skills and qualities, but the core construct of it is it came about because when Mark and I first came across to policing, his job was to improve the interviewing of children and other vulnerable people in particular, and to train to that. So, and mine was to improve the interviewing of suspects and improve investigators' knowledge of sex offenders themselves. And so incidentally, in interviewing, when we come and talk about that, Mark and I both assumed that there were different kinds of interviews, and that we had to go and find out how to do this kind of an interview and then that kind of an interview. And by the time we'd done our homework, we realized that it's more or less identical, the skills and qualities you need and processes to do both interviews. So we could talk about that later. But the other thing we found out is there was always someone who knew how to do this. There was always someone who got given these cases. There were always police who loved this area of work. And I think one of the things I most surprised me in policing was how many investigators are passionate about investigating sexual crime and family violence and those areas, and are now delighted that there is an avenue, really, because it wasn't kind of part of the general culture. And I think of several things that told me down the years. Well, one guy said, I asked him why he did this work, and he said, he got 5 kids. He said, because if anything happened to my kids, I'd want them, my motivation is to give the best possible service, because that's what I'd want if anything ever happened to my kids. And another guy told me once, he said, I got into policing to help people who couldn't help themselves. And I was surprised by how many coppers say things like that. And that when they get into, we call it socket here, Sexual Offence and Child Abuse Investigation Team, when they get into a socket or now into a family violence investigation unit, how passionate they are about that. It seems to attract a certain kind of copper, and I really love working with them. But what we found is that they weren't part of the core culture in policing at that time. It wasn't very valued. So when they all became detectives, there were jokes about the color of they call the badge here of Freddy. There were jokes about the big pink Freddies, and it was kind of girly crime and all that sort of stuff. All of those have gone by the wayside now as everybody's grown up. But what we also found is that underneath it all, they couldn't see where the winds were, which I mentioned before. And when we went around the place, we're trying to work out why that is. We went to visit trials, so we went and sat in court. And having come from the offender treatment field, where they told me in incredible detail what they did and how they did it, when we looked at how it was presented in court, hardly any of that information was presented. And look, I'm not sure we've got long enough to talk about the problems with adversarial justice and arguments that defense run, but there is an article everybody should read out there. Zeiderfeld, I think, is the first author on it. But anyway, look up defense strategies in sexual cases from the 1950s and the 2000s. And look, and so they looked at, has anything actually changed in adversarial justice? And I won't spoil the surprise for people, but yes. So given the structure of court process, not surprising that it was a very frustrating process. And I went back into the office and said to Mark, that was so unfair. That jury didn't get to hear the whole story. And both of us went, first of all, that's quite useful. And then, but how would we do that? And then we started looking at what it was police were investigating, where they thought the evidence was, what was relevant. Then we were slightly assisted in, there was a change of act here. And so they brought in what's called the Uniform Evidence Act here. And it had a slightly more generous interpretation of relevance and what could be adduced in trials as relevant evidence. And so when we made our arguments about where the evidence was and how it might become part of the brief, and in fact, essential part of the brief, then we had some credibility to that. There were lots of things that we could do to say there's a new methodology and this will be more useful to you. But really, it all hinged on offending starts with offenders. This is a relationship-based crime. This is a crime of relationship, not a crime of events. It's a crime of relationship. The evidence is in that relationship. Let's go and find it and get as much as we possibly can before we determine whether or not there's a reasonable prospect of conviction. And what then came with that, and I think, I know lots of police forces around the world have shown that training affects attitudes and beliefs. I don't know how many have shown, as we have, and we published on this, that not only does changing to this kind of construct and the training that we had, the 4-week course that we had, not only does it change attitudes and beliefs about victims and victim behavior, but we maintained that after a 12-month field follow-up study. So we think those changes come about because of a focus on the skill sets and the things that make you competent at this job, but more importantly, because of what they now understand about offender behavior, much greater understanding of victim reactions to that, reducing myths and misconceptions and so on, so that they could feel competent as investigators. They knew what they were looking for, and their attitudes towards victims changed and stayed changed. And that's been a really big deal, because if you're going to get victims to tell you the depth and breadth of what happened to them, you need all the other things that good trainers in policing, good police forces around the world are doing. You need victim-centric processes. You need the right kind of buildings. You need the right kind of people. You need places that children want to talk in. You need to reassure people. We have a process here called the options talk. It's not really a talk, it's a process really, but that bit where you tell people, well, you've told me this, these are your possible prospects in the criminal justice system here, this is what might happen. It was horribly open to abuse. I mean, if you looked at that and said, I don't know how I'm going to get this to court, you're an investigator, you said, I don't know how I'm going to get this to court, then you could easily dissuade people from going forward with that. So the devil is in the detail about how people do every single aspect of this job, and where they see the success and what their knowledge base is. So I suppose we're back to that point early on in this discussion about how do you take this body of knowledge and put that into an organization that has a different frame.
So practically, what does it look like? Is it, so it's obviously so for example, the training or the whole process. One thing is obviously influencing police misconceptions, myths, and attitudes. Yeah. It's also about how to deal with and interview offenders as well as the victims, and then they provide a whole completely different set of evidence to the decision maker. And have you noticed then any impact on the decisions that were being made as a result of this process here?
Yes. So let me get to that down that line. So number one is get the story. Listen. The number one skill in policing is listening. And so some of the things we found also in our interviewing, which I know lots of, if there are English colleagues watching here of training, the UK has absolutely led the field in interviewing, and the tier structure and all the other reforms that have been brought in have come in to deal with the problem that I'm going to describe now, which was that closed question. I'll ask the questions, you give the answers, that very wooden style that gave people no free narrative whatsoever, has shifted widely around the world, and the UK has been a leader in that. We obviously adopted that too, and the work of Martine Powell and others over here, and with interviewing children. So we have a free narrative form, and free narrative only works if you know how to listen. And so that's the number one skill set. Not everybody has it, that capacity. So when you listen, the next element is, if the training has set in, as you hear it, you will hear the offender's pattern. You will hear the manipulations and the grooming. So you get the free narrative and the second run and the third, and you get the depth and you get the breadth. And then you go to those areas, from understanding of the way offenders operate, to continue to probe that to see where the detail is. And we have a phrase in the whole story called unique signifiers. You're looking for unique signifiers. So for example, presented in court later on, let's say an offender gave a child gifts. As just a general gift, it may or may not be useful to know that. But if you know precisely what gift on what day, it's useful right the way through the process. In suspect interviewing, for example, if you were to say the difference between these three questions, did you ever give the kid gifts? Yes or no? You probably get I don't know, or I can't remember. Tell me about the gifts you gave them. Might get more of a, oh, well, maybe on a birthday or blah. You might get some kind of interaction. But what if you said, tell me about the red remote control car you gave so-and-so for his 13th birthday? Now, what you get in that suspect interview in that moment is, if that is indeed what took place, and chances are it is, because very, very few people lie about sex offending, contrary to popular belief, and we can talk about that more if you want. If that didn't, in fact, take place, he then is coping with the fact that the investigator has that knowledge. He may well be running in his memory at some part, thinking about the time that he did that. He's also concerned about, how he deals with the information that they have. Should he come up with a story now, and so on. So detail gives you power and leverage in an interview. Leverage to not to bully people, but to say, you really need to come up with a story now, because we've got a lot of evidence here, and so we want to hear your side of that particular story. So it's a good way of in fact creating rapport and getting people to connect in that conversational style. So number one, listen, get the detail, get the unique signifiers, get the grooming, and within that it will open up. And here's something that traditionally police have always been really good at: give them an avenue of inquiry. And one of the things that always struck me, I was amazing how quickly good investigators get on to find things out when they've got a good lead or a good avenue of inquiry. So how do you do that? Like, people may not have seen the offending itself, but oh boy, they saw the grooming. There's a case that we talk about where one of the children is offended against, the daughter is offended against, the son, who is older, gets sent to bed first as a way of getting him out of the way. And the wife is out doing night classes, which he has persuaded her to go and do, so he can have access to the child. Now, they don't know anything about the offending itself. I mean, from the cases, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, but in this particular case they didn't. But boy, did they know a lot about the construct of his offending. So give people an opportunity to see where the avenues of inquiry are, to see where the witnesses are to certain aspects of that, and then make sure that you can articulate to a court that it is relevant. It's relevant evidence that can be adduced in court. You have much greater prospects of success. So the next bit, in answer to your question, is it changes the way investigators feel about this crime theme. So I think the biggest thing that we've done is shift their knowledge base, and where attitudes were maybe problematic in some way, it shifted that, but it's given them a confidence to go and see where evidence is in cases, and find relevant evidence that's useful in that brief. I also know of a number of cases where they've gone back through previous reports and found other cases that were relevant to that. So historical cases that weren't prosecuted for one reason or another that now are. I'd love to be able to say that we've done a detailed analysis of conviction rates in Victoria, and that it used to be X and now it's Y, but we didn't do that study because we don't have the time and the money. But I suspect the way adversarial justice is constructed, then if things have improved, they've mostly improved in the investigative frame, in some cases being authorized that otherwise wouldn't, but without quite significant reforms or changes to processes of justice. I don't think we will ever see wholesale shifts in conviction rates. Perhaps if we move to professional jurors, or New Zealand, you look at the work of Suzanne Blackwell and Fred Seymour, they ran studies with jurors in child sexual abuse cases where juries were presented with non-case specific education about child sexual abuse before the trials went forward. And surprise, surprise, defense used many fewer myths and misconceptions in the way they behaved during the course of those trials. They also looked at what evidence needed to be present in order to more likely lead to a conviction. And there were some of the more traditional elements. I can't remember the exact, there were 5 or so, there were 9, I beg your pardon, there were 9 key elements. But a few of them, some of them were to do with the presentation of relevant evidence. So we are still convinced that whole story, its main benefits are for victims when they present, in the way they get treated, in the way they get listened to, the way their story gets taken, the depth and breadth of their narrative, and the presentation of relevant evidence. We also know from studies done by our victim support agency here that victims of sexual crime who used to be amongst the least satisfied, if not the least satisfied, with their treatment by police, within the first 10-year period of these reforms are now the most satisfied with their treatment with police. So we know it has an impact in that area. I think you're talking, like when Mark and I first started, we looked at all the issues around the system and in policing and in the courts, and we thought, crikey, this is going to take decades. When we can do this teensy little bit of something. And I think that's still true. You know, it's a somebody asked me and we went to talk to a commission once, and they said, is this best practice, whole story best practice? And I said, well, I think it's better practice. I don't know what best practice is, because at every single element of the system isn't right yet. So it's an improvement. It's better for investigators. It's better for victims. It's better for developing relevant evidence. Do the numbers back up that it's better in court? No, not yet. They don't, but they will in the next decades if we shift some of the things that are problematic.
So, to what extent is whole story already being used and implemented? I know you've been training it for a while. Is it something that is being applied by Victoria Police in every single relevant offence, or is it just a number of officers who've been trained in it?
Well, there are now, it must be nearly 500 by now. So there's another, at the time I stopped working, because I finished working with it last year. We had trained over 600 investigators, and at any one time in Victoria, there are 450 specialist sexual crime investigators who've all done this training. There are also elements of this, of whole story, in the family violence investigator training, because there are now, I think 150 now specialist family violence investigators. I think where we're moving, hopefully, I don't know the big poll is, but I think in general where policing is moving is that it's seeing relationship-based crime as a specialism, and that the skills and qualities required. And let's talk about that now. So we did some studies of our investigators, and we asked them pre-training, post-training, and 12 months out in the field about the skills and qualities needed, and we also asked them about their attitudes and beliefs. And bear in mind that it's important. Most of the people that we saw in our training courses had been police officers for 5 or 6 years. Some were older, some were senior officers who'd been around a long time, but the bulk of them had not long been detectives, had decided this was an area they wanted to be in, but they'd in effect already been trained as uniform coppers, and now they were coming to do their specialism. So you get into that whole thing I was alluding to before of, in one sense, you've got to detrain people and retrain them for a different way of interviewing and a different way of seeing this crime thing and so on. But anyway, that side. So when they came to us, they were relatively new, and most of them had not met the crime thing before. So they were a good population to survey, both for their attitudes and beliefs, but also for the skills and qualities. Now, I haven't got time to take you through the whole study, and I would bore you senseless. But at the end of 12 months, after pre and post training, at the end of 12 months, they said the top 5 skills and qualities required for an investigator of sexual crime were, I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the order right, empathy, which actually was top in all 3 time points. But the others shifted slightly. Number 2, good communication skills. Now, I think put those two together, absolutely fantastic. Haven't got those, never going to be good at this. Number 3, patience. Number 4, good investigative skills. And number 5, open-mindedness. Now, I remember getting into a bit of an argument with a couple once who said, well, that's just, any detective needs all those 5 things. I'm thinking, yeah, they're probably useful. But if you haven't got those in this area, you're not going to be good at it. If you're not open-minded because you get led to misconceptions and you think coming back for coffee is tantamount to consent, blah, blah, or you get confused because the kid kept going around to the guy's house or whatever it is, you're never going to be good. So empathy, good communication skills, patience, good investigative skills, and open-mindedness. That's what we're looking for. And I've lost the thread of the question now. What was the beginning of that? I got caught on that because I so wanted to tell you about the skills and qualities. I forgot what the beginning of your question was.
Well, the original question was, to what extent is it being applied? And
what's it, right? To what extent is it being applied? So there is a maintenance of the specialism and the specialist training across SOCET that will go on. I have found, since talking to other police forces, so trained in all sorts of areas all over Australia, done some online stuff in the States, done some work with Becky Milne at Portsmouth Uni, trained investigators in Iceland, in Norway, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, all sorts of places. That the fundamentals of understand the offender, understand the dynamics of sexual crime, relationship-based crime, understand where the evidence is and know how to put that evidence together to persuade a fact finder. That's been uniform everywhere as a need. And even in countries you might assume were really very enlightened, the range of myths and misconceptions within the general public and within some of the police force itself is still quite striking. So back to your first question, or one of your first questions, what have been the surprises or the most staggering surprises? I'm still surprised by some of the attitudes and beliefs people have about rape and sexual assault and child sexual abuse, and how victim blaming a range of those beliefs are in this day and age where we have this much information about how this actually happens.
I think it's time that more of this whole story approach needs to be infiltrating policing all around the world, and for them to get just, I think there's so many aspects to it, like you said, the victim treatment, the finding the actual evidence, because, you know, you're right, if you're just looking at and that's one of the problems in so many of sexual offense cases, the evidence can't be corroborated.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Well, actually, but if you look at everything that led up to it, there's so much more in there. And I think if you, I know that you're releasing a book soon, and I had a quick look on Amazon. It didn't have a cover yet, but I've got a vision to share that with you. I'm sea of icebergs, and
right.
the tip of the iceberg just being the event. And let's say the book is called A Whole Story Approach, and then the subtitle is Finding Your Evidence. What do you think?
Right. Well, it's already got a title, but I like that. I like the iceberg idea. I'll tell them. So the title is The Whole Story, Investigating Sexual Crime, Truth, Lies, and the Path to Justice. And that's coming out in July in the UK with John.
If you want, so yes, it's up to you. Never mind.
But I like the iceberg idea. I'll definitely let them know. And look, I think the other thing is we've got a couple of other books out. So myself and a colleague, Gemma, are writing a book on the intersections of family violence and sexual offending, and looking at, you know, different terminology and how the fields are related and how they're not. And I mean, we could have a whole other interview on the differences between investigating family violence, investigating sexual crime, and looking at how much sexual offending there is in family violence cases, and how much child sexual abuse there is within the family violence field, but also where the differences are. And like, could you have one specialism, for example, when so many, you know, it looks like the vast majority are in relationship, but there are also, you know, some key differences there. And so we're writing a book about that, myself and Gemma, and also hoping that Becky Milne and Steph Sharman and I are going to work with a bunch of writers on some core skills in investigating sexual crime. And hopefully that'll be out in the next few years as well. Because like you, I'm passionate about that notion that investigators are given the best, most up-to-date knowledge about whatever field they're in. In this case, we're talking about, you know, rape, sexual assault, and child sexual abuse. I think policing, certainly here, and I'm sure in lots of other places, come miles in the last decade, really shifted. The cultures have shifted, and there is a passion and an enthusiasm for investigating these crime themes that definitely wasn't around 20 years ago when I first started having coppers come and ask me, you know, to help them on cases. 30 years ago was even worse, but it's changed a lot. And whether you use whole story or not, whatever methodology you're using, it has to include offenders at the core of that seeing who they are, what they do, why they do it. It's understanding the dynamics of these kinds of relationships that they construct, whether they take place over 10 minutes or, you know, 20 years. You really need that. And one of the things investigators have said to me that I found probably, you know, the most satisfying in a way is that they can see the offender now. They can see him and they can hear him. And so all those questions about why was she wearing that, why was she out late, and blah, 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 they become far less relevant when, from listening to her, they're listening for him, and where the questions are about him and the construct there. And any training that you're doing in this field has to have some version of that in whatever way, whatever you call it. Yeah.
And actually, you and I are talking about possibly bringing that training to a lot more people around the world by making it possibly available online, so location dependent. I had another question come through from Chant Dot, actually one of my subscribers. Hello, Chant, thanks for watching. When looking at victim blaming and the whole story approach, are text messages shared between victim and offender sufficient evidence in court? For example, a string of messages demonstrating coercion.
Well, that's a really good question, and thanks for bringing up social media, because that's been one of the bugbears of coppers in recent times. I mean, if you look at what technology's done, we've really barely touched on it yet, but so yes, text messages are relevant, but it'll come down to, because some of these guys are really savvy about it. So, for example, it is not uncommon the night after a sexual assault or rape for a flurry of text messages from the offender to the person that they have sexually assaulted or raped, saying, I mean, sometimes they're threatening or bullying or intimidatory in some way and fairly obvious. At other times, they're not. They'll say, thanks for last night, or you were so hot, or it was great, can't wait to meet up again. And complainants do come in and go, like, what was that about? Like, he can't possibly have thought that was something that I enjoyed. Now, we would spend a lot of time in training, time we don't have now, but a lot of time in training going through the distorted thinking of offenders. We talk about implicit theory. So again, we haven't got time to talk about that now, but the way we help investigators understand sexual offenders, we use implicit theory, which is a construct of helping them understand how offenders see the world. So we would talk about that, like, what's going on in this guy's head? Why has he sent that kind of a message? And partly we're doing that for avenues of inquiry or for other things for investigative matters, but partly because when you come to work with prosecutors, they're going to need to be able to argue for the interpretation of that text message, what it meant and what effect it was intended to have on the complainant in that time. So yes, text messages are useful, but they still require a lot of work, both from the investigator and the prosecutor, to help whoever's listening to the story, whoever the fact finders are, to understand that. And the other thing I wanted to say about social media is that it's become very onerous on victims now to have to open up their lives, their phones, their Facebooks, their Twitters, and everything. And the main reason that has come about, and aside from the technology now that's available and the fact that that's the way people communicate now, is that it potentially gives defense an avenue to attack the credibility of the complainant. And in that article I was alluding to before, the 1950s to 2000s one of its conclusions is the central job of defense has not changed over the years. The central job is to destroy the credibility of the complainant. And so social media is being used in order to find elements that say, well, she's not who you think she is. And in particular, in terms of what you're alluding to, text messages between complainant and alleged perpetrator, suspect, whatever, they're looking for anything that says her version of events isn't correct. And so it puts a lot of pressure on investigators, both from the volume of it, just because there's so much, but also for their ability to understand the nature of the abusive relationship, despite potential evidence to the contrary in all that social media feed, to be able to see what was really going on underneath, or perhaps not, because occasionally, these things are not correct. And whilst I'm on that, let me just do the false reporting bit now, because I think it would be remiss of me not to tackle that. So one of the reasons that Mark and I got jobs was because of a 2004 Law Reform Commission report. You can look it up, Victorian Law Reform Commission, Sexual Offences 2004. It's a long read, but read the conclusions, because about policing, what they said was, there are cultures of disbelief within this police force. There's no specialism, there's no specialist knowledge. And they included statistics about where the investigators they had spoken to, admittedly not that many, I think there were only 20 or something, but what they felt the false reporting rate was somewhere between 40 and 50%. and they thought it was higher in country areas, which is, you think, well, why might that be? Anyway, we haven't got time to talk about that. So the real figure is somewhere between 2 and 10%, probably closer to 5 than 10. And there is overwhelming evidence of that. And I'm happy to send links to anyone who wants to contact me through you to send them those articles. So why was it that police put the figure so much higher than it actually is? And what we found over the time of doing the training was largely because they didn't understand what had taken place. And so, for example, when a complainant was cool in their demeanor when they were telling their story, they would think, but people are supposed to be upset when they've been sexually offended. When there were no injuries, and this is a killer, prior inconsistency or people changing their minds. When they came in and told an investigator one thing, but it wasn't that, it was this. Why did they change their minds? All those elements would confuse them, and they would see it as potentially, lying in some form or another. So the real figure is 2 to 10%, probably closer to 5 than 10.
I'd like to have those articles, please, if you can send them over. Very interesting.
Done.
Now, just to bring this to a close, what are the main takeaway points from what we've talked about today that you want people to remember? So if you just give a summary of the most important bits you want them to walk away with, what would they be?
What would they be? Policing always had this knowledge. It was always there. The skills, the qualities, the knowledge, it was always there in policing. And I think now what we're seeing is that it's becoming more the norm than the exception. That there is value. Policing values this work now in a way that it didn't. So that would be one. Two, we are still dependent on an adversarial justice process that is Judith Herman, the famous writer on trauma. Trauma and Recovery is still one of the best books, in my view, ever written about this subject matter, and I heartily recommend it to any of your people listening in. She said, if you were going to, and I'm going to horribly mangle what's a lovely quote in the book, but she said, if you're going to create an environment to traumatize already traumatized people, you couldn't do better than an adversarial court. Mm-hmm. So we're still working in an environment that isn't good for people. And that environment is still, not only is it the practices of that environment that are problematic, but number two, the biggest one, myths and misconceptions. Investigators need to understand what is myth and misconception in sexual crime. And the way to do that is to get training in how sex offenders operate, what they do, how they do it, why they do it, and the impact that has. 3, grooming. Understand grooming 1 and grooming 2, however it gets described. Make sure that you see the breadth and depth of relevant evidence. And then the last one, probably all wrapped up together, is I would advise any police force to find the right people, train them well, look after their mental health and well-being. That some people need to rotate, but some people are great in this area and they can exist in it for years and years and years. Find the right people, look after them, and maintain the specialism of investigating relationship crime, because it is a unique area of policing. They're my top 4.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Patrick.
Thank you.
And,
thanks, Susanna.
I hope that
Thanks for everyone for listening in too. I hope that was useful in some way.
Yes, and thank you very much, and we'll stop here.
Have a good day.